Okay, and we are going live in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar, which is part of the 2020 ESB IIEA lecture series entitled Rethink Energy. And I'd like to begin by thanking the ESB for their sponsorship of this event. And at the Institute here, we very much value the collaboration with the ESB in this series. We're delighted to be joined this afternoon by a most accomplished and interesting speaker, Sir Philip Lowe, who's partner in Oxera Consulting and chair of the World Energy Council's Trilemma project. And I'd like to thank Philip in particular for being so generous with his time to speak with us today. Our guest will speak for about 20-25 minutes, and after his presentation, we'll go to the Q&A session with you, our audience. You'll be able to join the discussion using that Q&A function there on Zoom, which you should see on your screen, and we're all becoming so used to all of this functionality now on Zoom. So please do go in there and send us a question, and feel free to send your questions in throughout the session, as they occur to you, rather than waiting until the end. So if you've got an insight, if you've got a brainwave question, just pop it in as soon as it occurs to you. And I would ask, though, that you would identify yourself, your affiliation as well, if you have one, when you're asking a question. I'd like to remind you that both the presentation and the Q&A session today are on the record. And if you're given to Twitter or tweeting, please do tweet in the course of the session. And the handle for us is @IIEA. So before we turn to Sir Philip Lowe, I'd like to welcome Pat Fenlon. Pat is the Executive Director of Group Finance and Commercial at the ESB. I'd like to ask Pat to say a few words. Once Pat is done, he'll introduce our speaker, and Pat will be remaining with us for the Q&A session. And Pat may be able to contribute, or we may like to contribute. I'm sure we'd like him to do that, to any questions which have an explicit Irish dimension to today's discussion. So once again, I'm looking forward very much to our guest speaker, and also now to Pat Fenlon, who will introduce our guest. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everybody. And just on behalf of ESB, just want to welcome you to, I suppose, what's now the fourth lecture in the Rethinking Energy series. It's a program that ESB has been proud to be involved with for over a decade now, and looking forward to today's address by Sir Philip, which I think is really timely, both in relation to COVID-19 and Brexit, particularly in the context of how that will impact on the energy transition, which is a subject very dear to our hearts in ESB. Our Brighter Future strategy is all about leading the transition to a low carbon energy future. And what that will involve for us is substantial investment in transformative projects that will, with the aim of ensuring secure, affordable and sustainable electricity supply for our customers into the future. Brexit, I suppose, like many of you here on the call, is something we've been following closely in Ireland in recent years, and it's certainly heating up, as we know at the moment. ESB has been involved in the UK energy market for over 25 years, right across networks in Northern Ireland, where we own the NIE business, but also in onshore and offshore investments right across the UK, and also in EV charging infrastructure. So it's a core market for ESB. Regardless of what happens with Brexit, and I know we're all hoping for a sensible transition and an outcome to that process, but regardless of what happens, we will continue to work closely with our counterparts in the UK energy industry to hopefully continue on that transition towards the clean energy future. COVID-19, of course, has had a massive impact on all of us. In ESB, we developed our first pandemic response plan in 2006 following the SARS outbreak. And helpfully, and it might be fortuitously, but I suppose good planning, at least a good luck, we carried out a crisis management exercise for a pandemic 6 months before COVID struck, and that did stand to us when the outbreak happened earlier this year. And the focus in ESB throughout COVID-19 has been ensuring, first of all, the safety of our employees, our customers, and the general public, but also to maintain an essential electricity supply throughout that period. In the first half of 2020, ESB has delivered a solid, resilient set of financial results despite COVID-19 and the looming Brexit. But maintaining financial strength for ESB is really important to allow us to deliver the investment that's required in the future in both low carbon generation, but also in our electricity networks, which are crucial, not just for economic development and supply of electricity, but also for electrification of heat and transport, which is a critical plank of the transition to a low carbon energy future. We've seen on the international capital markets, debt capital markets, a massive appetite for sustainable investment, and pleased to say that ESB was the first Irish company to launch a green bond, a public green bond in 2019. And we see that appetite for such investment continuing. We do remain optimistic, despite all the challenges. The climate action bill from the government, the Irish government, and also from Europe, the Green Deal, I think, really sets the course that we're all on to respond to climate change. So without any further ado, I'm really looking forward to Philip's address. I think it's timely, and I think anything that helps us kind of understand the context and the challenge better for the energy transition will help us all get there. So without any further ado, look forward to your address and hand over to Philip. Thank you.
So Alex and Pat, thank you very much for those introductions, and it's a privilege to be speaking at the IIEA in your energy series. I have to say, I feel a degree of humility surrounded by people from ESB and EirGrid and SODI and CRU and others who have contributed to the strategy in Ireland. You know as much, if not more, than I do in many areas, but I hope that I can give some kind of strategic view from a European perspective, which will be useful to you in the future deliberations which we're having. Of course, in all the history of the European Union and Ireland, we've always talked about peripherality, and I have to say that the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on us all is that we seem to be all peripheral because we're all somewhat isolated into our own homes. But I hope that through this type of webinar, we can have sufficient interaction to be able to debate the issues as we would have done if we were together. So I'd like to proceed first of all by looking at some slides which I've prepared, and I've prepared them. I can assure you all with a certain degree of objectivity, because I don't represent the Commission anymore, even though I was Director General for Energy and for Competition, amongst other things, and I certainly don't represent the UK. Both institutions probably regard a British European, ex-British European official as somewhat suspect. So I think you can guarantee a certain degree of objectivity in the process. If we can move to the first slide, I think that as far as energy is concerned in Europe and in the UK, there's been in fact a long-standing alignment of UK and EU energy policies to create open, integrated and competitive energy markets. And there's been a similar alignment on environmental and climate change objectives. But of course, as the result of Brexit, the UK ceased to be an EU member state on the 31st of January, and with the notable exception of the arrangements for Northern Ireland, EU law will no longer apply to the UK after the end of the transition period on the 31st of December. And in that process, from the in terms of the content of the original withdrawal agreement, the UK specifically ruled out membership of the EU single market, the customs union, and by the way, the ETS. Now, the withdrawal agreement also makes it clear that the UK will no longer participate in any EU institution or agencies. So even though, I'll come back on to that later, there are references in the political declaration signed between the UK and the EU on energy, they don't relate to some agencies such as ACER at all. And as far as the transmission of TSOs are concerned, we talk about simple dialogue and cooperation. So if we move to the next slide, we can look a little bit more closely at the content of the declaration and what it has meant so far in terms of the negotiation. I think virtually everyone in the whole of Europe and the whole of the world knows that the UK is trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU. Seems to be a rather narrow version of trade cooperation, but is also quite a narrow version of what could be a future EU-UK relationship, because an FTA agreement, as envisaged, only is limited to removing tariffs and quotas on goods, therefore excludes the services sector, and excludes agreements on non-tariff barriers, which is, of course, the major problem of regulatory alignment. Now, there is also a commitment on either side to prevent distortions of trade and unfair competitive advantages, as well as maintaining high regulatory standards, but not to regulatory alignment, which has led to a degree of distrust and suspicion as to whether the UK intends to, in the kind of vocabulary which has been used by UK politicians, to break free from regulations at EU level and perhaps adopt a more buccaneering approach to trade and competition vis-a-vis the EU. There's a commitment in the political declaration to cost-efficient, clean and secure supplies of energy based on competitive markets and access to networks, and to facilitate technical cooperation in order to ensure security of supply and encourage sufficient trade through interconnectors. But there's clearly no reference to any maintenance or development of shared market rules and network codes. And there's a commitment to continued cooperation, as I've referred to earlier, between systems of TSOs, but no mention of cooperation between regulators. So if we go on to the next slide, we have some positive elements in the protocol, which are very important for Ireland and Northern Ireland. No hard border in principle, protection of the all-island economy and of the energy market, respect of the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, maintenance of the single all-island electricity market, continued application of EU laws and regulations in Northern Ireland in respect of this, the internal market on the island of Ireland in terms of state aid rules and competition rules, and continued North-South cooperation. Now, there's a reference in it also to best endeavours to stimulate trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK single market. As you are aware, the UK government is now, on a unilateral basis, trying to strengthen this through its proposed internal market bill, which is in principle in contravention with the terms of the protocol and the withdrawal agreement. But we wait to see what the outcome of that discussion will be. On the next slide, we turn to the immediate impacts of Brexit on the energy sector, short-term impacts and perhaps then long-term impacts. Now, unless there is no deal, we shouldn't exaggerate that the immediate impacts will be very substantial. UK and the EU energy policies remain largely aligned, similarly with climate change policies. Both sides have raised the ambitions for CO2 emissions reduction for 2030 and 2050. And the UK has transposed the bulk of existing EU energy directives into national law. And thirdly, which is obvious, the UK remains physically connected in gas and electricity to EU member states, notwithstanding the 1,000 megawatts to Ireland, to and from Ireland. There's also up to 4,000 megawatts of interconnection with other EU countries. And given ongoing cooperation between TSOs, one would expect that trade will continue to take place, and even new interconnectors like Green Line are under construction. Of course, if there is no deal, there's obvious potential for delay and confusion. I see that possibly more in terms of gas trading than in electricity, but widespread disruption is probably unlikely. Clearly, technical agreements will have to be made, and ultimately, if there is no deal now, the question would then be, will there be a deal sometime later? So will this be a question of some interim arrangements? And the important thing there, as you all know from with the experience of European negotiations, try and prevent the provisional from being permanent. Now, on the next slide, I've turned to the longer term impacts, and I've referred already to the fact that there's no commitment to regulatory alignment. It's unlikely that the market rules and network codes will continue to be aligned unless the UK is somehow associated to EU discussions on the design and the adoption, that adaptation of energy market rules. Now, one might say, is this one-sided? I think the fact is that it's reluctance on both sides. EU agencies and committees can invite third country representatives to participate in their discussions, but there are plenty of voices within the EU who dislike the idea of the UK choosing the parts of the single market which it wants to be involved in and not others. And obviously, if there is divergence on market rules and network codes, this is going to lead to less efficient market functioning, less competition, less liquidity as well. On the next slide, I think that obviously your focus will be on Ireland itself and its own security of supply. From the end of this year, Ireland becomes an energy island in EU terms, in principle cut off from the rest of networks in the EU. And it's logical in that respect that the Celtic Interconnector has become a European project of common interest, with a direct link between France and Ireland, and a commitment of 500 billion from the EU budget for that project. But of course, we don't expect that to come on stream until 2025. There is certainly more and more self-sufficiency through renewables, but for the moment, Ireland is very much linked with the UK market, both in electricity and gas. There's a UK commitment to North Sea cooperation, but as you've probably read, there's some degree of discord as to whether the UK could stay in that cooperation framework. It wasn't, if I remember rightly, as Director General, for energy, it wasn't an EU body at all in 2010. But since I left, certainly, North Sea Energy Corporation has become co-chaired with the Commission, and it seems that there is a debate as to whether the UK could be involved or not. Well, that's connected to the wider debate about UK willingness to participate in EU-sponsored initiatives. And of course, there is also a discussion as to whether local content should issue rules, should influence the decisions taken on construction of offshore equipment. So on the next slide, we turn to further measures. Well, here we go into the realm of perhaps more pragmatism in the way in which we could go forward, given the blockage on institutional grounds. One could expect that there will be some degree of, as Alex has referred to, brainwaves or insights as to how future cooperation could be guaranteed, whether the SEM, despite being now based on EU market rules and network codes, one could not form some kind of framework in which the UK could take part in that, and what would possibly be some form of coupling of the UK market with the EU and with the Irish and the rest of the EU markets. Energy efficiency will remain a key component of all discussions on security of supply. And certainly in Ireland, where it has to think very much about the potential need for backup generation capacity. Whether, as we have seen recently, gas-fired power plants figure in even a transition scenario is not clear, but it may be that they are not a thing of the past, at least until 2030. So then we turn to the next slide, and we add COVID-19's short-term impacts. I think all of you have seen the reports of the IIEA on the impact on the energy sector. An average 25% decline in demand, a 50% decline in oil demand, a 50% drop in road transport year on year, and inevitably, because of the uncertainty associated with COVID, a fall in investment in energy. Nevertheless, overall, energy systems have been resilient during the crisis, and Pat has referred to the situation in Ireland itself. Globally, low carbon sources of energy are overtaking coal as the primary source of energy for power generation. They have priority access to grids and low operating costs. Investors are tending to steer away from fossil fuels at the moment, taking a longer term view than governments. Gas demand is also likely to fall by 5% in this year after 10 years of growth. And we've seen in the last, we expect in 2020 a fall in CO2 emissions. As I wrote here, a decline which is 6 times larger than the fall resulting from the economic decline after the financial crisis. So if we go then to the following slide and take a longer view, I've referred to the fact that investors are favoring renewables, but of course prices of oil and gas are historically low, and using existing fossil fuel power plants is still a viable option in the short term if regulations permit it. And oil and gas are also needed in all modes of transport, at least until 2030. Maybe we can see displacement of oil by gas in maritime transport in particular, and also in commercial transport. Looking at the long term, there's a lot of aspiration around. The European Council has highlighted the crucial role of energy in Europe's economic recovery and underlined that the economy needs to become greener, more circular, more digital, building on the European Green Deal. That's thankfully a commitment which hopefully all the member states of the European Union will sign up to. And it's something which the UK, amongst other third countries, share as an objective. If we move to the next slide. The crisis obviously has had an effect on consumer behavior and on the location of economic activity. We're all experiencing and living through the trend towards teleworking, to online purchasing, as well as delivery to and services in the home. And it's fair to say that it's unlikely that people, and particularly businesses, are going to return to previous working, shopping, and servicing habits. And that may have implications for energy demand patterns and for distribution networks, which I'm not qualified to talk about, but I'm sure that it is being studied by ESB and others. The economy is becoming increasingly digital, with a consequent increase in demand for electricity for service, for example. It's becoming increasingly digital with some degree of impact on the market power of major players, major high-tech companies. And this is a challenge for competition policy globally. To what extent, with this increasing digitalization, we have really any control over the from a public point of view on the behavior of these companies. For the time being, public transport, all modes, as well as car sharing, don't offer people adequate protection from the virus. And one can see the renewed importance of the private car. And if anyone can afford it, electric vehicles. Lockdown measures hit poorer people harder than others. Energy poverty has become an issue again in all our countries. If we move then to the following slide, I'd just like to refer to what colleagues in the IIEA have referred to as a ripple effect, and draw some preliminary conclusions from the interaction of these various impacts and almost crises on our own lives. Before Brexit, we were already facing the challenges of recovery from the financial crisis and engaging in the energy transition towards a greener economy. Now, while Brexit is happening, we have a pandemic which is persisting with no final solution yet in sight. One talks of vaccines, but even as we move forward, we don't see an immediate horizon for the use of those vaccines. And as for Brexit itself, this is, after all, a political and economic crisis of some dimension, at least for the UK and also for its immediate neighbours, the ones who are most affected in the European Union, that is Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands, France. The UK has imposed this because of a democratic vote, and successive governments have, since the referendum, chosen to interpret what that vote meant in terms of perhaps a harder rather than a softer exit from the European Union, with full withdrawal, as I referred to earlier, from EU institutions, agencies, and in principle, even any program. the EU's response has also been to emphasize that participation in the single market has to be total, not partial, with the acceptance of all the responsibilities as well as the advantages. And that can lead to some degree of deadlock in some of the talks which have taken place between the UK and the EU. So in the next slide, I just go on to look at what could be the basis for further progress or resumption of progress. I think the energy market is one example among others where the UK and its European neighbours have the potential to retain and expand the cooperation and links which they've already established between each other within the EU. But this requires a lot of more mutual trust and confidence and a degree of pragmatism to develop new frameworks which both sides can live with, even if they both feel uncomfortable in them. And then in the next slide, I just recall, apart from the benefits which are obvious through a cooperation in energy and market interconnection and integration, finding a new framework requires everyone to work together, absent institutional preconditions on both sides. And that's a major challenge at the moment. That being said, if you look back at the history, in Ireland in particular, the spirit behind the Good Friday Agreement should, in principle, inspire everyone to work towards energy solutions which are good for Ireland, for Northern Ireland, for the United Kingdom, and for the European Union. I was reminded when addressing this theme before that Patrick Kavanagh had something interesting to say about the issues which face us, or the challenges which face us in life. In his poem Epic, I have lived in important places, times when great events were decided, who owned half a rood of rock. That was the year of the Munich bother, which was more important. And today we have a combination of the challenge of climate change, we have the challenge of a pandemic, we have increasing, so far, lack of support for multilateral action and cooperation, and we have Brexit. Which of these issues is the most important for the future? I think that Ireland has always shown the example. It is necessary to build alliances and find common solutions. That's the basis upon which the European Union has worked to find solutions which can't be achieved by one country on their own. Now, that can always be challenged in individual areas, but pragmatically, both the UK, Ireland, and the European Union must look for areas where progress can be made, and energy is one of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, for its eloquence, and for the assistance of Patrick Kavanagh in bringing home, I suppose, some of the points that you wanted to make. And I think we often do turn to the poets, and I think the period we're living in at the moment, we're turning to our poets perhaps even more often than we have in the past, and that's probably a pretty good thing. So thank you very much for those insights. We've got a number of very interesting questions lining up on the Q&A function. And just to remind everybody again that you can use the Q&A function just down in the bottom, well, on my screen, sort of bottom right-hand corner-ish of your screen, and go in there and just send a message, just like sending a WhatsApp message or a text message, and that will come through to us. And some of you have been doing that already. So I'm going to start off with a couple of quick questions some of which you might like to try and at, but maybe some perhaps might be from Councillor Sarah Riley, whether you believe the North-South Interconnector project will continue. Now you might want to change that yourself into whether you think it should continue as opposed to whether you think it will continue. But do you have any thoughts about the interconnector?
Well, I mean, it's one component of an increasingly, well, should be an increasingly integrated network, which offers some degree of advantage, both in terms of security of supply, resilience of systems, and is an important component of the links which should be maintained and promoted with the UK, from Scotland to Northern Ireland, and those from the south of Ireland to the UK, and ultimately to France as far as electricity is concerned. So I think the issue is, do I believe that the North-South Interconnector project will proceed? Is my answer, first of all, is that I think it should proceed, and that for the reasons I've just emphasized before, we have to look at, we have to tolerate and work on the issues which separate the UK and some of the interests in I from the aims of the project, and find out and create frameworks where it can go ahead. I believe that it should go ahead personally. I think that studies have shown that it would be of tremendous benefit. It's not the only answer to energy problems on the island of Ireland, but it's one important component.
If I'm not mistaken, I think Sarah might well be channeling some and reflecting on some of the controversies, let me put it that way, on infrastructure that we've had locally. So, I mean, that's obviously the subject of ongoing debate, but the big picture point you've addressed. And in fact, the next question is also about interconnectors more broadly. It's from Fergal McNamara, who's the chair of the World Energy Council Ireland. I think you may know Fergal. I've come across Fergal, and known to the here. And Fergal says, in light of announcements, in light of the announcements of new interconnectors, GB to Norway, and another one to the Netherlands, and GB to Denmark and Iceland, how can this be reconciled with the portents of increasing divergence of market rules?
Well, just to final word to Sarah on the interconnector. I mean, one of the things we tackle very much in the European Commission, and we're tackling outside it as well, is making sure that local communities are fully aware of the benefits of any infrastructure improvement, and finding ways in which they can be associated with and the projects concerned. So it is always going to be a major challenge, but it's something which requires a lot of public debate and an open discussion, looking at the overall advantages, but also taking into account the impacts on local communities. Now, as far as the interconnectors are concerned, I think that after a period of some hesitation in the early 2000s, the successive UK governments, coalition government under David Cameron and Liberal Democrats, but also later have committed themselves to supporting interconnection as an important contribution to security of supply and to more liquidity and more competitiveness on the UK market. And of course, if then you are confronted with the institutional challenge and the political challenge of Brexit, you have to say, well, how can you, on the one hand, want to develop such systems which are interconnected and integrated without common rules? Now, I have argued this myself with many of my compatriots who are whose names are well known in UK politics, and they say, well, we don't want European rules, we want international rules. And I say, well, which would you prefer? You want US rules or Chinese rules, or would you like those rules to be perhaps more adapted to conditions in Europe? And the answer is, well, there is an institutional blockage on this, that the idea of European Union being some kind of political organization which is taking away the identity and powers of autonomous countries in Europe is something which is very strong in the political flavor of the moment in London and elsewhere. But I personally believe that the practical advantages of these interconnections, the fact that they are not just simply with EU countries, but they're with Norway, which is obviously part of the single market. And there's also plans for interconnection with Ireland. And in the end, the practicalities of working out how to manage transmission capacities and manage trade inside on electricity will dominate ultimately on the over the institutional issues. Now, how long will that take? I don't know. I just simply believe that in order to recreate the trust and confidence on the UK side, at least, we have to provide a framework for talking about market rules and network codes, etc., which doesn't necessarily have labels which make them withdraw completely from any discussion.
Thank you. Another question here from Donal O'Brolacon, who's a member of the IIEA here. Any lessons for us from existing EU links with another energy island, quote unquote, for example, Switzerland or Norway, also noting Norway's powerful position as an energy supplier? So any lessons from Switzerland, Norway,
I
EU
think,
links?
Alex, the Donal is correct to look at these comparisons. I'm not sure that one could describe Switzerland or Norway really as an energy island, because physically they're very much interconnected with the European market. Whether they're, and of course Norway as part of the single market is very much in it, whereas Switzerland isn't. What can we learn from Switzerland? Well, the first thing to say is that Switzerland has the same sort of institutional issues with the EU as the UK, although perhaps a smaller scale, and a different location, geographical location, which is right in the middle of Europe. And what has Switzerland been trying to do since it has rejected EU membership and rejected single market membership? It's tried to negotiate sectoral agreements with the European Union in a large number of areas. I think there are already over 100 agreements between the EU and Switzerland. And frankly, the EU has been increasingly, I say EU, the other member state, the EU member states have been increasingly impatient about this, that Switzerland seems to want to do a certain number of things with the European Union, but is not really prepared to accept the common rules. of, for example, competition policy and of state aid. And so there is now increasing reluctance from the EU to go into more agreements with the EU, with Switzerland, even though it would make eminent sense for it, on practical grounds for it to do so. Now, it may be that if you look at it in the future, in 10 or 15 years' time, it may be that the combination of UK and Swiss pressure to reach agreements on interconnection and on trading across the European markets will result in some degree of a greater degree of pragmatism on the EU side, but it would also probably imply that on the Swiss and UK side, they have to accept some institutions, some agencies, regulation or on transmission system operation, which are supranational, which is, of course, the thing which they are not, that the UK side is not keen on for the moment. Now, as far as Norway is concerned, I think there is a direct lesson to be learned in terms of how Ireland and the UK and other EU countries could cooperate together in achieving some degree of market integration without it being necessarily in an EU framework. And that's the development of the Nordic electricity market, which is now more and more integrated into the EU system, but at the beginning began with cooperation and trading between the Scandinavian countries. And I think there's an opportunity for people in the UK, Ireland, and elsewhere to talk to those in Finland, in Norway, and Sweden, and discuss how that cooperation began and how it could be a useful model for future cooperation until we get some wider solution.
Actually, I could have combined the following question with Donal O'Brolacon's question, because it comes from John O'Hagan, Professor of Economics in Trinity College, and he was asking, is there any other non-EU state with a similar interdependence in terms of energy supply with the EU as has the UK? And he was just wondering, well, could similar arrangements be applied? Now, you reflected on some of those points already. I don't know if anything, I think I've reflected additional occurs to you from that.
I think because one's self-criticism of the EU and the EU member states, which it ought sometimes to be asking itself, or member states of the EU as a whole, is to have an agreement with another country outside the EU doesn't necessarily mean that they have to conform to EU rules. There is a general assumption of, I wouldn't say regulatory imperialism, but it's something like that, which derives from the depth and strength of the discussion between EU governments and between national administrations. If we have reached, or I say we, but if EU countries have reached an agreement between themselves, between 27 member states, they're not particularly keen on adapting those rules for a third country, because they've already reached a very, very difficult compromise between them. And so there are countries outside the European Union who would very much like to have energy relations with the European Union, but they are basically at the moment in the category of countries which are regarded as potential accession countries or association countries. I'm talking of the southeastern Europe, in Bosnia and Serbia, as well as, of course, the Ukraine. And if you look at what the EU has done, irrespective of those countries in the energy area, it's created, sponsored the energy community, which comprises the EU member states and accession countries, basically, and it encourages them to adopt EU energy market rules. And the same is true of the association agreement with Ukraine. So that's another category of countries beyond Norway and Switzerland and Iceland, by the way, which could be, is an example as a model, but it's a model which is unlikely to be very attractive to the UKs and the Switzerlands.
Okay, I've got two questions about gas. First of all, David Kelly of Ervia, which includes Gas Networks Ireland. And David says that you've referred to gas being necessary for the interim. How long is this interim, in your view? And what technology will replace gas? And the second question is from John Drynan of Electric Ireland. Should Ireland reconsider the planned LNG terminal in the Shannon estuary for security of supply reasons? So two questions. How long is the interim and what will replace it? And then the LNG proposal. I don't know, I'm sure you're familiar with the Shannon LNG terminal proposal, but
I find more difficulty with the second question because it's in the end it's a commercial question, and one would have to make a clear assessment of the short and the risks and advantages. By the way, the more integration, if I can answer that question first, the more integrated gas networks are in Europe, and therefore the more competitive is the price of gas in Europe, and not simply price of pipeline gas in Europe, not simply determined by take-or-pay contracts with the two or three major suppliers around Europe. The less attractive is LNG, because if there are flexible long-term contracts and a good secondary market in gas, then generally speaking, pipeline gas into the European networks should be competitive vis-a-vis LNG. But of course, LNG is an alternative which is an investment to be made, particularly when you think of possible disruptions of supplies. And although the LNG terminals have historically had very low utilization rates, they have nevertheless, from time to time, served their purpose in dissuading those major producers who felt that they can possibly increase prices and exploit markets simply because there's no alternative. And frankly, the LNG market at the moment seems to be fairly liquid. The gap between the price of pipeline gas and LNG is certainly a lot narrower than 10 years ago. To be cautious about gas, providing we answer the first question, which is how long will we need natural gas? One should go ahead with the project to be cautious. But then look at the potential for gas in the future. What are the what is the major debate in Europe about gas? Is it viable to still invest in gas now? We are in 2020. We have very significant CO2 emissions objectives for 2030 and 2050. Does it make sense to put any more money into gas-fired power stations? Well, you could start the kind of discussion which is being debated in the Netherlands and Germany. Why don't we try to diversify the types of the sources of energy which are being used in gas infrastructure, particularly the use of hydrogen, either blue or green. Trying to, in fact, to move away from fossil fuel of the CO2 rich gas to less CO2 emitting gases, but recognizing that at least in the next 10 years, gas will be needed, whether for heating or for industrial purposes. And then there's the issue as to whether gas there aren't new uses for gas, such as I've referred to in maritime transport and in commercial transport. And here again, there may be a link between the second question about LNG and the first question. If there are new markets for gas, particularly maritime, isn't it better to import LNG for those purposes and use it there? Frankly, Alex, I'm not replied very clearly to either of those questions because I think they're quite difficult. I think that what we previously thought was a fairly clear situation for gas over the next 10 to 15 years has become less certain picture because of the revised CO2 targets. That being said, there must be some new thinking about how to use the extensive gas infrastructure in Europe, which is there and which is an advantage. And therefore, biogas, hydrogen are among the alternatives we should look for. And on the issue of Shannon, I have to say I couldn't express a clear view, but I would, to be cautious, would be hedging bets and not abandoning something which could be useful later on.
Yeah, no, that's understood. We've got a couple of other questions on gas and hydrogen, but we're coming up on 2 o'clock. And I do have just one other question here, which I'll also ask Pat to come in on, if I think Pat is still with us. It's from Ken Spratt, senior civil servant here in Dublin, and I worked very closely with Ken when I was Minister for Energy myself. So Ken is a real leader and huge knowledge of this field as well. But he also very nicely brings back in the poetic allusion from earlier, from Kavanagh. And Ken points out that Kavanagh finished that poem, Epic, by mentioning Homer's ghost. Quote, "I made the Iliad from such a local row," unquote. Yeah. Is a line we all remember. And the question is, and as I said, Pat, by all means, perhaps Pat might come in on this first, and we are coming up on 2, so we're a bit tight for time. The question is there an Iliad in this for Ireland? Perhaps harnessing from offshore wind, Ken wonders. Do you like to handle that, Pat?
Sure. Well, I think offshore wind, there is a massive opportunity in offshore. And we all know what the wind is like on the island and what it's like off the island. We are coming from behind in terms of harnessing offshore wind, and I'm pleased to see the government are taking steps to accelerate, the MAFA bill, and the Minister Ryan is on record as being very strongly promoting the take up of the offshore wind industry. And of course, ESB would be a participant in that, hopefully. But it is a massive opportunity. I think it does come back to earlier questions as well about interconnection, because what we need more renewables, better system services and better interconnection for all of this to hang together. But there is definitely an opportunity in this transition for Ireland, given the huge quantum of wind resources that we have. So absolutely, conscious of time, maybe better let Philip come in on that one as well.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I understand it, Ireland is already, during the night, a net exporter of electricity to the UK because of offshore wind, because of onshore and onshore wind, both, but particularly onshore, and that's a potential which should be exploited clearly. Although, I mean, the reality is that once you're in an integrated competitive market, is it correct always to refer to export opportunities and import opportunities as if national borders actually define the markets, which sometimes they don't? I think what's being defined is really where are generating plants, or where is sources of energy located, and what opportunities are there to sell their product in the rest of the EU or elsewhere. And I think prospects are good. I referred incidentally to the debate about local content, to what extent new installations have to be supplied, manufactured locally. Ireland still remains in a very strong position vis-a-vis the UK because of meteorological conditions and sea conditions to be able to exploit the market there, as well as frankly with France. But I'm not sure that. I just want to answer one question which I see on the screen, which is, can gas-powered generating stations be run from gas shipped by sea? Yes, they can. There's no reason why you can't use LNG for electricity generation. Lithuania has done it with its own LNG plant. LNG, therefore, is a source as it represents an alternative supply, both to for all forms of energy. But of course, you've got to look at the economics of transforming LNG into electricity, which may or may not be as competitive as in the present circumstances, for example, as to using renewables.
Thank you. Just before we wrap up, just to remind people that the next event that the Institute will host, covering the issue of offshore wind, so that's timely for people and interesting for people, it's with Ala Weinstein of Trident Winds, and that event is on Friday, the 20th of November. It's not the next event of the IIEA, but it's the next relevant event to offshore wind on Friday, the 20th of November at 2 p.m. So it only remains for me to warmly thank Sir Philip Lowe for his presentation this afternoon, for his answering and addressing of questions, including those that I put to him and those that he had the flexibility and dexterity to see himself on the screen. So I want to thank him for giving us the benefit of his immensely wide knowledge and experience and insight. It's been not only very informative, but given us, I think, a lot to think about and reflect on. I want to thank again Pat Fenlon and the ESB, and note again the importance of the collaboration that we have that the IIEA has with the ESB on this series. So it's been an extremely informative and interesting experience this afternoon. A number of phrases always stick with me after these occasions, and one is where in the course of your presentation towards the end you were talking about the importance or the desirability of countries working together absent institutional preconditions, which covers really quite a multitude when one observes what's happening at the moment in terms of what the possibility, what the options, what the chances for cooperation will be post-Brexit as elsewhere. So thank you once again, Sir Philip Lowe, for your presence this afternoon, and thank you all for your attendance. And there we will finish for today.
Thank you for your hospitality, Alex and Pat. And just to finish on the green recovery, which I noticed a question we didn't cover, that's an aspiration.
Because I'm told I have to cut off.
Yeah, that's an aspiration.
It is, yeah. I mean,
which I hope we will